are going to start with our first panel, and to kickstart the conversation about all of these issues, we are going to begin with the topic of, from the enactment of the Outer Space Treaty to now, how has the space domain changed? We are very privileged to have today an excellent panel who are going to join us online. First of all is Aaron Bateman. He is a technical intelligence specialist at Johns Hopkins University. We also have Cassandra Steer. She is a senior lecturer at the Australian National University College of Law and mission specialist at ANU Institute of Space. We also have Guoyu Wang. He is an associate professor and dean of the Academy of Air Space Policy and Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology. To moderate this panel, we have with us here Ruth Hill. She is a counsellor at the Permanent Mission of Australia to the United Nations in Geneva, working on issues in disarmament. Please, Ruth, go ahead.
Good morning to everyone. It is great to be holding in-person meetings here again in Geneva, so a big welcome to everyone who's been able to join us in the room, and fantastic also to be joined by so many participants online. So wherever you are dialing in from, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you too. Can I begin by thanking Robin and the whole space team at Unity for bringing us together for this conference. The program does indeed look fantastic, and we have a great lineup of speakers. I'd also just like to briefly add my note of thanks to the two keynote speakers from this morning, to High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for outlining in such a clear and compelling way why building a sustainable space security architecture is so important. And also to Ms. Shirisha Bandla for her very inspiring and indeed tangible reminder of the importance of a peaceful space domain and the very great potential that it holds for all of us. I'm delighted to be kicking off the first panel today, which will be looking at how the space domain has changed from the time of the enactment of the Outer Space Treaty to now. And I think that Shirisha's address is a fantastic prelude to this conversation and a very clear demonstration of just how much it has changed. So, going back to the time of the Outer Space Treaty, which of course entered into force in around 1967, during the Cold War, a time of great political tensions, and it was hoped by the drafters of the treaty that it would assist in preventing those tensions from reaching the space domain. But that is a feat that the treaty has failed to fully achieve. We have then seen the emergence of the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space agenda, or PAROS, as it's known, and I think it's also fair to say that progress on that front and in achieving the objectives of PAROS has been slow. So in this panel, we're going to dive into more detail on the ways in which the space domain has changed, particularly with the emergence of new actors, whether that is new spacefaring nations, or whether it is the exponential growth of commercial sector interests in space, and also noting that this is happening in a context where we are all becoming increasingly dependent on space domain for our prosperity and security. And then we're going to look at how all of that has impacted arms control and disarmament efforts in space. So at this point, I would like to introduce our three excellent panellists who will be assisting with this discussion, all of whom are joining us online today. Firstly, we have Aaron Bateman. Aaron is a PhD candidate in the history of science and technology at Johns Hopkins University. His research explores the impact of US anti-satellite weapons and missile defence development on arms control and transatlantic security during the Cold War and after. Prior to graduate school, Aaron served as a US Air Force intelligence officer with assignments at the National Security Agency and the Pentagon. He has lectured on contemporary space security issues to academic and government audiences in the United States, Europe and Asia, and his work has appeared in a range of journals. So welcome to you, Aaron. Next, we have Cassandra Steer, and I should say a fellow Australian. Cassandra is Senior Lecturer and Mission Specialist with the ANU Institute of Space at the Australian National University College of Law. She has published widely on space law and space security, including the application of the law of armed conflict in outer space. She has been a consultant to the Australian Department of Defence, the Canadian Judge Advocate General's Office, and the US Department of Defence on these issues. She's also provided space law expertise to my department, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Following 8 years as a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, Cassandra held positions as Executive Director of Women in International Security, Canada, Executive Director at the McGill Centre for Research in Air and Space Law, and Interim Executive Director of the University of Pennsylvania's Centre for Ethics and Rule of Law. She's also a member of the Australian Space Agency's Technical Advisory Group for Space Situational Awareness, an associate expert on the Woomera Manual on International Law of Military Space Operations, and a member of the International Institute of Space Law. So welcome to you, Cassandra. Finally, we have Guoyu Wang. Guoyu is the Associate Professor and Dean of the Academy of Airspace Policy and Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology. He's also Deputy Director of the China National Space Administration Space Law Centre, a legal counsellor in space law at the CNSA Lunar Exploration and Space Project Centre, and a board member of the Advisory Committee of the Secure World Foundation. He's also been a space security consultant at UNIDIR, an Academy Senior Fellow of Chatham House, and a visiting scholar at the National Centre for Remote Sensing, Air and Space Law at Mississippi University. Guoyu has served as a Chinese delegate to COPUOS and the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, as well as a Chinese expert in the Long-Term Sustainability for Outer Space Activities Working Group. He's an editorial member and expert of the McGill Manual for International Law Applicable for Military Uses of Outer Space, known as MILAMOS, an expert of the Hague International Working Group on Space Resource Governance, and a member of the Global Experts Group for Sustainable Lunar Activities. So welcome, Guoyu, to you as well. Fantastic to be joined by three experts in the field. Now, in terms of the structure for the panel this morning, I'm going to ask each of our panellists in turn to give a few remarks on the general topic of the panel. We will then have a discussion around some questions that I will address to the panel, and after that I will open up the floor to questions from the audience. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to the first of the panellists, Aaron, to say a few general words about the topic of the panel. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to say up front, just provide a disclaimer that my views today are mine alone and don't represent the official policy or position of the institutions with which I'm affiliated. So in many ways, we are experiencing a sense of deja vu in the space security community. A lot of the questions we are facing are not new. These are questions that have been faced before during the Cold War. Today, the only, I would say, key difference is that they're being faced by both state and non-state actors. These questions include how our emerging space technology is going to affect strategic stability. What will be the impact of a growing commercial space market on space security? Can certain kinds of counter-space weapons and/or behaviors in space be restrained through arms control? Will security primarily be decided on a bilateral basis or in a multilateral forum? How can we establish norms of behavior that promote the responsible uses of space? So it's important to recognize that these fundamental issues are not new, and we need to use the lessons of the Cold War in particular to inform how we answer these decisions. In the final years of the Cold War, the superpowers were able to agree to new arms treaties that reduced their stockpiles of nuclear weapons, but they did not make significant progress in establishing, in the words of some officials at the time, rules of the road for space. So we emerged from the Cold War with progress on nuclear disarmament, but little formal improvement in space governance. At best, there were tacit norms, but in the 21st century, we have witnessed the erosion of these tacit norms and behaviors. So what are some of the key developments since the end of the Cold War that have implications for arms control and disarmament? The deeper integration of space capabilities into combat forces around the world, the proliferation of missile defense systems that also have anti-satellite weapons applications, easier access to space, which has resulted in significantly more space actors, both state and non-state, a closer integration of commercial and government space organizations, a proliferation of non-kinetic counter-space weapons in the form of cyber tools and electronic warfare systems, more non-governmental space surveillance capabilities that have challenged traditional notions of secrecy in the space domain. A final point in my introductory remarks is that we need to separate rhetoric from reality with regard to the present space security situation. A significant parallel between the present time and the 1980s in particular is there is much hyperbole about space races and space as a potential battlefield. Since the first artificial satellite was launched over 60 years ago, combat has neither originated in nor extended into outer space. Consequently, it's essential that we not see conflict in space as inevitable. It is necessary that we accurately identify the present challenges, responsibly use lessons from the Cold War to inform our decisions, and work towards realistic and meaningful arms control goals that will better promote space sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Aaron. I'm going to pass now to Cassandra for some introductory remarks. Cassandra, the floor is yours.
Hey, Ruth, and I really would like to thank all the organisers of the conference for making it possible to join remotely. When I look at the list of speakers for the following panels, and even my fellow panelists today, I really wish that I could be there in person with friends and colleagues, but I'm grateful to be able to join you remotely. And in fact, my comments echo very much what Aaron just said about we're in a bit of a deja vu. In some ways, things have changed drastically, and in some ways, things really are very much the same as they were when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated and signed in 1967. So technology obviously has advanced remarkably, and that has brought with it some new kinds of challenges, but really in some ways we've come a full circle. Geopolitics have changed dramatically. We find ourselves today in 2021 in a multipolar reality, and yet at the same time, the fact that space politics really are geopolitics expressed in another domain is exactly the same as it was during the Cold War. So the impetus for the Outer Space Treaty, as Aaron mentioned, was to ensure that the tensions of the Cold War wouldn't extend into space, or at least that they could be contained. And I think that remains very much the same in our multipolar world, with although the tensions and the actors have changed slightly, the very impetus for having that framework treaty for keeping space stable and secure and peaceful remains exactly the same. And of course, the actors, both the number of actors in space and the type of actors, as has been mentioned a few times already, has changed. We have a great many more actors in space. We have an enormous amount of congestion in space. There is more political competition and therefore more strategic tension in space. But that is just a matter of degree rather than an actual change of factors. And really, the Outer Space Treaty, as I said, has to be seen as a framework treaty. I would actually disagree with one of the key assertions that was set up for this panel and that Ruth mentioned in the introduction, that the Outer Space Treaty has failed. It was set up primarily to deal with a very basic but important form of arms control in space, to ensure that no single state could become the dominant state in space by having the non-appropriation principle. The peaceful purposes principle, of course, and although we have very many military activities, and although space is a strategic domain unto itself, not only because it supports terrestrial warfare operations and supports militaries, but because of those space-based capabilities becoming a strategic target in many ways. At the same time, the peaceful purposes principle was put in place to contain exactly that. And of course, the notion of state responsibility for commercial actors as well as for state actors. And in that sense, again, I would say not only has not much changed, but the Outer Space Treaty has been very successful in containing what could have become very rapidly a domain of conflict. I would also say that I would want to qualify a little bit the Cold War narrative. Aaron's comments were extremely important, but what I would add to that is we often forget that the Cold War period was not just about the relationship between the Soviets and the US. Why did so many smaller nations, middle powers and many smaller nations, sign the Outer Space Treaty? Why were they involved in the negotiations, and why did they support it from the get-go? That's because their interests are also protected by the Outer Space Treaty, and that was very clear to those smaller nations already in 1967. And that's very much important today. Many, many more countries have access to space, are active in space, and can influence the politics of space because we're in a multipolar period as of the 2020s. And so we want to think about those smaller players as being incredibly important and influential. So I've written a couple of articles that point to not only the role that these smaller nations and multitude of actors play in 21st century space governance, but also questioning who really has the power when it comes to determining space governance and who has access to space. And I don't mean by that only launch, although I really did appreciate also the comments by Sarisha about the diversity that inspired her own trajectory into space. But space, one of my pieces is called The Province of All Humankind, which critiques the fact that space, in fact, has always been dominated by an elite, whether that's a small elite of nations or, in fact, also a wealthy elite, a white and gendered elite. And again, I'd like to highlight what Sarisha pointed to in terms of that is starting to change. Those who are starting to have access quite literally to being able to travel in space. But really the space sector is still very much dominated by elite countries and an elite group of individuals. I was quite moved by Antonio Guterres's comments about the malady of trust that we see in 2021. And he pointed to the concerns about billionaires' joyrides in space while people on Earth go hungry or while we face the pandemic. And in another deja vu, it reminds me a bit of Gil Scott-Heron's quite famous poem in the 1960s, Whitey's on the Moon, which was critiquing the fact that a white elite was spending millions on getting to the moon when many others were suffering. It points again to the geopolitics and the fact that what's going on in space reflects what's going on Earth. That is not to critique the space sector, but just some of the activities and some of the way the money is being spent. Is that getting better? Well, in 2021, the World Space Week coming up in October is, the theme is all about women in space. And diversity matters a great deal. We also have, of course, the Space for Women program that comes out of UNUSA. We have the wonderful Simonetta De Pipo, who's the director of UNUSA. Perhaps things are getting a little better in terms of diversity, gender diversity, and access to space, but we need to keep all of those aspects in mind if we're talking about security, stability, and sustainability of the outer space domain.
Thank you indeed, Cassandra, very much. And now we'll move to our final panelist. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the floor and a very kind introduction. Good morning, evening, good afternoon to all. It is indeed my great pleasure and honor as well, to join this panel together with our, distinguished colleagues. So I just faced some technical problem at my home, so I have to come to the office of my colleagues. So I hope it will not bring any confusion. It will not affect, today still, I would like to speak at my own capacity. So talking about the changes in space domain in the new era, both Aaron and Cassandra just mentioned several aspects. I would like to address the challenges to the applicability of lex lata in particularly space security issues. So I would like to introduce briefly the significance to seek for common recognition of lex lata in this case and the challenges to it and a way forward. Briefly, of course. So if you look at, the around 40 standing points papers, submitted to the office, most of them just highlight the significance to comply with international law, to reaffirm the, significance of compliance with international law. However, very few of them, I think, just touch upon the challenges to such kind of application or applicability. So first, to comply with international law, of course, is the paramount precondition, the guarantee, to prevent conflicts in space. And then common understanding of lex lata is the key element to enhance the consistency of predictability of all states regarding the legality of space behavior. Subsequently, it will definitely facilitate an effective settlement to space disputes once such kind of prevention fails. So talking about the challenges during the discussions, in the past years, no matter in the LTS working group or Milamos project, I found so many disagrees or uncertainties, agrees of course, about the applicability of lex lata to national security space activities, always say military space activities. And personally, I think it could be deemed as we just trapped in the gray area. It means that some period or area between, we say, the purely peacetime and wartime. is talking about a military contest or even confrontation in such area. First, we have different views about the scope of the applicability of international law, whether all the principles set up in the Outer Space Treaty would apply in such kind of gray area, or whether general international law, for instance, like the law of states' responsibility, customary international law, or the law of use of force, or HL, all of them would just apply in this case without any particular concerns or conditions. I think it's still open question. And I would like to just give a very brief case, specific case to show such kind of uncertainties. It's about the legality of laser dazzling espionage satellite. So during those discussions, we have many questions to be solved, like whether the obligation of prior consultation applies in this case, whether the dazzling state is supposed to come to the dazzled state, to ask for consultation just before to take such kind of action, and whether and how the obligation of, we say, due regard applies in this case, and whether even laser dazzling for the purpose of counter-espionage should be deemed as exploration and use out of space. If not, it means space law, does not apply in this case. So as the way forward, so I think to do systematic researches on and common recognition of the applicability of lex lata to specific military space activities one by one should be served as a priority and even a starting point in respect of the development, or we say evolution of the process of PAROS, just like what is undertaken by Milamo's project. So it is a matter of informal or formal interpretation of treaties from a legal perspective, and a difficult but invaluable endeavor to pursue consensus and compromise among different political wills. And the last point, talking about certain philosophy or rationale should be considered and subject to in the process of the above mentioned common recognition of lex lata. Three principles. The first one is principle of self-refrain. It is that the behavior is always supposed to be limited or restrained in the appropriate way to honor the true spirit of the freedom in space. The second is the principle of equilibrium, means that the due balance has to be pursued when examining the legal boundary between contradictory space behaviors or any other military space activities. And last one is the principle of common interests. So it's not only about to preserve a stable, sustainable space environment, but also a strategic stability and equilibrium in space. Thank you. I just stop here.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Guo Yu. And I think some interesting themes coming out from the presentations just there. What struck me was a sense of some things have changed, but then some things indeed have not changed that much, a sense of deja vu. Obviously, the technology has evolved, but geopolitical tensions play out and play a significant role. And we're seeing questions around the applicability and of the law as it stands, as you were talking about, Guo Yu, and questions about how that applies in certain contexts, and those discussions are ongoing. So an interesting context set there for us, I think. I'm going to move now to some specific questions that I'm going to address to the panellists. And I'm going to start with a question going back to the Outer Space Treaty. And I should say, Cassandra, you're absolutely right. We should not be unkind to the Outer Space Treaty. It has indeed, in many respects, stood the test of time very well, I think. And I think it's just interesting to sort of look at the thoughts the drafters had at the time, what has changed, and where that leaves us now in terms of where we should be going with the regulation of outer space activities. So my first question sort of follows from that. and it is. The Outer Space Treaty is a treaty of principles that allows for significant freedom of action. And I'm going to ask the panellists, what do you think are the pros and cons of this characteristic, both at the time it was enacted and now? So I might mix up the order of speakers a little bit here, and I'm going to go first to you, Cassandra, followed by Guoyu, then Aaron. So Cassandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruth. And I guess at the other end of the spectrum is we shouldn't be too optimistic about what it is the Outer Space Treaty can do and has done. So certainly it's challenged in the sense, and you know, just a few years ago in 2017, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary, and you know, every radio interview I heard or took part in, every webinar, every conference, the question was asked, is the Outer Space Treaty still fit for purpose? Can it still serve the purpose of space governance in the 21st century? Don't we need to update it? Should we perhaps reopen it for renegotiation? My answer remains consistent, which is that it is a framework treaty, and we want to see it the way we look at national constitutions, which is it's there to set down principles and values and a guiding star, you could say, as to what are the most important values determining what is or is not possible in space, to limit and contain the potentials. And you know, and you're quite right, Ruth, in saying it's there to limit the potential for geopolitical tensions to reach space. Well, geopolitical tensions are playing out in space, but it has been successful in preventing a conflict in space to date. So it's a constitutional framework document. It's not there to regulate specific activities or specific actors. And what we need as technology changes and as we have, you know, the commercialization of space, of the space sector, more than half of all satellites are owned by commercial operators. The new race to the moon, and I'm very cautious of the use of the word race, but I do think there's a bit of a race on to get to the moon. That is going to be dominated, the technologies and the supply of that is going to be dominated by commercial players as well. But we should not be looking to open up or redraft or debunk the constitutional framework document. What we need is more specific regulations, and that's how most national legal systems work as well. Your constitution is a core document that is deliberately broad and deliberately difficult to change. And then you have lower level regulation that is faster to draft, easier to change and update if necessary. And that's the kind of thing we need to be putting in place. So the pros are, it remains a timeless, principled document. And that's the way we need to see it. And I do have faith in its ability to keep serving that purpose. But its limitations are its limitations. And we need to have in place different kinds of regulations, different kinds of space governance, multiple ways of governing the new kinds of activities. And we're seeing that particularly around space arms control and the PAROS initiatives, and in particular, the UN General Assembly Resolution 7536 adopted last year in October, which opens the door for many different kinds of initiatives and which has prompted states to put on record with the UN what their perspectives are about what are responsible behaviours in space. So multiple layers of governance is what we need moving forward.
Thank you indeed, Cassandra. Guoyu, I'll pass to you now.
Thank you, Ruth, for the floor again. And indeed, of course, I mean, Outer Space Treaty just grants amount of freedom, but there's no freedom without limitations. The Outer Space Treaty also sets up series of we say obligations or principles to achieve the balance there, to try to clarify the boundary in certain space activities. For instance, like I just mentioned, the prior consultation obligation, due regard, non-contamination, and you know, on the equal basis or without discrimination. And even just compliance with international law. So I think that it just reflects, first I would like to concur the views from Cassandra. I see many views talking about the Outer Space Treaty is too old. But actually for me, the Outer Space Treaty reflects the balance, you know, between the different concerns. And it just reflects the rationale of equilibrium at that stage. Both our two speakers mentioned the Cold War area. So it actually, at that time, misuse of the freedom means human beings might suffer a nuclear attack from outer space. So then we have Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, a so-called peaceful use principle. Just ban the placement of nuclear weapons and any other the WMD in space to eliminate the fear of nuclear attack from outer space, to seek for and maintain a strategic balance there. But there's a continuing debates about what is peaceful purpose. It should be interpreted as non-military, non-weaponization, non-aggressive. So nowadays, personally, I don't see any practice to show, a military space application is contravening peaceful purpose. However, it is still controversial about the legality of certain military space behaviors or the legal boundary of such kind of freedom. For instance, like electronic or cyber attack or interference, laser dazzling, approaching and accompanying flight, asset tests, placement of conventional weapons in space, etc. So again, just it shows the uncertainties of the applicability of the existing legal system in such kind of scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you, Guoyu. And now to you, Aaron. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of the remarks of my colleagues, but I think, like Cassandra said, to a large degree, it is timeless. It does still apply, I think, to the present situation. There certainly are shortcomings, but I think one of the important things to remember about the Outer Space Treaty is it does, to a large degree, create an ideal. The aspirational language provides a framework for potential future agreements. It highlights certain values that I think are timeless from the period in which it was formed to the present time. Given the challenges that we have, I think it still applies. But there are significant limitations. And talking about interference, I'll also build on that and just highlight that this is something that was a significant issue after the Outer Space Treaty. It's a significant issue today, even defining interference, what constitutes physical, non-physical interference. And so even though the Outer Space Treaty set certain fundamental principles, to a degree, outside of weapons of mass destruction, it's largely tech agnostic. And so it does provide a significant degree of interpretive flexibility as to what constitutes peaceful activities. And that is both good, but it also does create significant challenges because states can pursue their interests and decide what they think constitutes peaceful activity. And so just as during the Cold War, when peaceful activity at times was considered to be synonymous, or at least could be married together with national security and military activity, we see similar challenges today in trying to disentangle the complexities of those two issues, national security and peaceful activities. And I think that bringing in commercial space actors creates both opportunities and challenges to that framework, especially as commercial space actors in some cases are becoming further integrated into governmental space activities.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and everyone for that. So I think we get the sense that the principle-based nature of the Outer Space Treaty is indeed one of its strengths, and in the current era, it gives us something to build on. We've heard their comments around the interpretive flexibility, and in particular around key terms in the treaty such as peaceful purposes. So I think that's given us a good sense of the framework. I wanted to take the conversation now in a slightly different direction to the PAROS agenda. And I want to ask the panellists, what do you feel are the main reasons for the lack of progress on PAROS, and how can this be addressed? And do you believe that current developments, whether that's resulting from state or non-state actors' activities in space, are contributing to achieving the goals of PAROS? And this time I'm going to start with you, Guoyu. The floor is yours.
So superficially, I think it's due to the lacks of political will. We know that, but in essence, it is a matter of differentiated rationale or methodology about what is due order or governance of space and how to achieve it. So we see many concepts discussed broadly, like space hegemony or super priority, or we need maybe a strategic equilibrium or balance, which is more reliable to maintain a safe and sustainable space. I think, unfortunately, neither of the two sides would like to make a compromise, in a easy manner. So that's the different rationale there. So, and talking about methodology, we also see the different, like favorites about multilateralism or unilateralism, soft law or hard law, under auspices of UN or beyond UN. We see the different options right now. Also we have two different approaches, always say dichotomy, legal, illegal, or responsible, irresponsible. So which one is more practical or urgent as a way forward? So we see the different such kind of the distinctions, just served as one of the main obstacles, for the slow process of PAROS. And talking about the current developments, I think on one side, the various international initiatives, no matter from its governmental or from non-governmental entities, they are valuable to attract international attentions, to deeply examine the challenges to PAROS and the way forward. However, diversity does not always necessarily mean prosperity, but also means the risks of fragmentation. And subsequent high costs to seek for consistency, finally in the UN platform. So from a neutral and objective perspective, the stasis of PAROS process might show a comparatively stable strategic relations among powers in space. It means most of them don't have a genuine will to change the status quo, except some of them is deeply rooted in the goal of, we say, space hegemony, and it means that it is not satisfied with the balanced status at present. Then they would like to change it to achieve the priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Guo Yu. I'm going to throw the floor now to you, Aaron. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So yeah, in talking about why there's been a lack of progress, going back to the 1980s and then moving forward to today, I would say that fundamentally one of the problems has been that PAROS has been viewed as being in conflict with certain state priorities of specific states at specific points in time. And I think that this points back to something that Cassandra raised earlier, which is that space can't be dealt in isolation from other areas of statecraft. And so at specific points in time, when various states have viewed the principles of PAROS as being in conflict with an agenda that was being pursued, I think that has created certain fundamental difficulties, but also there's this larger issue of whether or not space security is going to be handled in a bilateral or in a multilateral forum. And certainly in the 1980s, when we saw a lot of the issues that gave rise or added urgency to PAROS coming to the forefront, certainly one of the challenges was there was a tendency to want to deal, at least among the major spacefaring nations, to deal with space security in a bilateral forum. And to a degree, we still see some of that similar behavior and similar tendencies today. But I think that it's important to just remember that whenever we're talking about potential options for arms control, space arms control in particular, that it has to be integrated into a much larger framework. It's not something that can be dealt with on a one-off basis. And that's regardless of it being addressed in a bilateral or a multilateral forum. But I think that given the number of space actors that we're dealing with today, given the rise of the commercial space market and their interests, it is even more urgent to deal with these issues in a multilateral forum.
Thank you indeed, Aaron. And now to you, Cassandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And again, we are a panel who agrees with each other a lot. But, as Guoyu mentioned, quite often it's easy to say, well, it's down to political will. But I think what happens, as Aaron mentioned, is that political will gets tied up in other issues. And space has often been a bargaining chip or has been kind of subsidiary to other interests. And I do think that's changing somewhat. So the political blocks, and I know in a UN environment, I'm not supposed to name names of particular actors, but when there are political blocks because of those interests that Aaron mentioned and those interests that change over time. But there is also a difference of priority that I would add to what Guoyu said in terms of what is it that space arms control or space security should focus on? So the Chinese-Russian proposal to have the PPWT, the Treaty on the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Space, has been very much focused on space-based weapons, the literal weaponization of space. And of course, the US, France, Canada, many of the allies of the US have been consistently opposed to that for various different technical reasons, but also because their focus has been not on space-based threats, but on ground-based threats. So not only kinetic ASATs, but also these kind of more gray zone, non-kinetic threats like lasing, dazzling, blinding, cyber interferences, jamming, and that becomes very complex, as Guoyu mentioned for us earlier, in terms of the legality of those operations. It's much harder to define when those technologies are a weapon, when they should be prohibited or banned, when they're acceptable. That becomes much more complex, and so it really depends on the priority in terms of what it is, what kinds of technologies are the focus of PAROS or of similar initiatives. And at the same time, the ambiguity that rises from the Outer Space Treaty and from the fact that Article 4 only prohibits nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, the ambiguity that comes with that serves the interest of some states who have said consistently they don't want to enter into any binding treaties that might prohibit more specific weapons, whether that's space-based or ground-based. But I think what we are seeing, and you asked us to think about whether current challenges and changes are contributing to perhaps achieving some of the, at least some of the intentions of the PAROS agenda. The fact that we're in this multipolar era again means that aside from those bilateral negotiations and interests that Aaron mentioned, there are also minilateral agreements and arrangements where space is now on the agenda more than it has been in the past. That's in the Quad, that's in ASEAN, that's in the rather controversial recent AUKUS arrangement. The G7 recently put space debris on the agenda and talked about it as an urgent threat that deserves attention. Space is back on the agenda at the level, I think it's at a level now that it was in the 1960s, that it perhaps, and was in the 1980s, that it perhaps wasn't in the period post-Cold War. And it's also back in the popular imagination again, for the first time in a way that it hasn't been since the space age, since the space race between the two superpowers. And that matters because when it's in the popular imagination, it has more political weight and more political pull. So there's now more of a focus on how we can regulate or come up with norms around behaviors rather than technologies. And I think that's a much more useful approach. It means we can find agreement and consensus much faster. It means whatever we come up with isn't going to be outdated. And we don't have to have quibbles over defining what is a weapon in space. We can talk about, the responsible behaviors agenda of UN General Assembly Resolution 75 to 36, once again, I think is very useful. And the initiatives that are going to come out of that are very useful. Space is part of the political economy of the 21st century. and every country wants some kind of purchase power in that, well, then every country also has an interest in space remaining stable and accessible and useful. And so it's become an agenda item that has a much greater importance than it had for those. It used to only be the powers and the countries that had access to space. And now it really is in everyone's agenda.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. And I think that's given us a really good summary on the PAROS challenges, if you like. Clearly, the political will is a fundamental question, as you've all alluded to, but these differing perspectives that we have on the way in which we should be taking this forward in a soft law or a hard law approach through bilateral, multilateral or minilateral fora, and how we should be doing this, what we should be focusing on, space-based weapons, ground-based, grey zone, and how we look at those in terms of behaviours versus actual technologies. So I think that's been a really good summary of the multitude of issues that come together on the PAROS question. And so on that note, I'm now going to throw the floor open for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation. I'm Pavel Podvik from Unitier. So since we're speaking about the Outer Space Treaty, and it is an old treaty, and my question is, what is your sense of urgency with building something new, not necessarily to replace the Outer Space Treaty, but to augment it, to make it stronger? And because again, if we look back at the history, there were periods of concern. I mean, the 60s was probably the first one. There was a concern about military uses of space. Then in the 80s, it was a fairly big issue, especially between the US and the Soviet Union. And now we see another kind of a wave of concerns about the developments in space. But at the same time, you could take kind of I would say, almost an optimistic view and say, well, I mean, 40 years down the road, we will still be expressing concerns about the developments in space, and the space will be there, and as it is today. So, what is your sense of how urgently we need to build some architecture that would regulate space activities? And do you see any events that would be kind of a watershed in a way, sort of something will happen and after that we are like in serious trouble? So do you have a sense of that? That would be very interesting. Thank you.
You know, I think the last great period of urgency was probably the 1980s. In the early 2000s, there was a resurgence in interest in certain parties and more strategic defense capabilities, and there was the erosion of the ABM treaty, but then largely petered off, and we're in a new period of renewed anxiety. And I would say that there is an overall sense of urgency, but I do think it's important to go back to something that I said earlier, which is to separate the rhetoric from reality, or rather the hyperbole from the reality. So we see a lot of new military space structures in different countries around the world, but military space structures don't necessarily mean that there's going to be this this precipitous decline towards you know, a much larger weaponized phase in the military use of space. But there's just two things that I would highlight that I do think are particularly urgent. One of those is more clearly defining what interference is. There's some disagreement, I think, among different parties on what would constitute especially non-physical interference, or what the repercussions of non-physical interference might be. Something else that I think needs to be urgently addressed, and it echoes something that Cassandra said, which is to try to limit certain behaviors rather than necessarily focus on limiting specific technologies, and that would be developing some kind of a framework for a moratorium on debris-producing anti-satellite weapons tests. I think that, you know, if we're going to talk about the lessons of the Cold War, one of the key things that we saw from that period is that it can be unproductive to get hung up on definitions of specific kinds of classes of weapons. So instead of doing that, I think a much more effective framework would be to focus on limiting specific kinds of behaviors like debris producing tests. And then just one final point about what is one particular instance or event that could be especially problematic. And I think that if we saw a state or even a non-state actor physically interfere with satellite of either a commercial actor, a non-governmental actor, or a state actor, I think that that could pose especially unique problems, especially if it results in some kind of not only physical but irreversible effects. So I think it's important to try to address some of the ambiguity, especially with interference, before we potentially come to that point.
It is urgent. It's urgent that we have something that builds upon the Outer Space Treaty. But in answer to the question as to what that might be, and perhaps also how urgent it is, I think that depends on what issue in particular we're thinking about. Is it arms control? Is it the creation of debris as part of arms control, or just, you know, space traffic management? Is it mega constellations? Is it natural resource extraction and commercial actors? Because each of those aspects, which are, you know, they're general principles in the Outer Space Treaty, it leaves some ambiguity. Each of those aspects probably has a slightly different degree of urgency and a different response that might be appropriate. I see no reason why we couldn't have an additional protocol to the Outer Space Treaty. And Pavel, I would say many old treaties are good treaties. I mean, you know, the treaties that set down the strongest principles, which then get applied to new fact situations. The Geneva Conventions are something we can all speak to, even if no one's opened them up and actually read them. We know how important they are in limiting the impacts of warfare, because they are principles that get applied to new fact situations and new technology over and over again. And there are additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which were written in the 1970s and 1977 in response mostly to what had gone on in the Vietnam War, to update and add on to those principles in what appeared to be necessary because of the urgency of the new kinds of weapons and this new kinds of warfare that involved non-state actors. And you know, so additional protocol to the Outer Space Treaty, I think, would be something that could be done fairly swiftly. It is, of course, an opt-in, so you then have to work very hard on who's going to sign up to something like that. But that might be one way of dealing with, for instance, the question around natural resource extraction or around debris. It could be one way to deal with arms control. I think that would be a more complex one to add in as an additional protocol. You know, and I guess another issue, I've seen some questions pop up in the Q&A via WebEx about, can we really say that, you know, that the peaceful purposes principle has been effective, given that we're seeing an increase in the militarization of space and these greater tensions around space as a strategic domain. And I think, again, I would echo a little bit of what Aaron just said about, it depends on what we're focusing on and undoing that hyperbole from reality. For me, it's also separating out, yes, it is militarized. Space has always been militarized. The question is, what's happening with that militarization? And most importantly, what are the doctrines and the policies and strategies being put in place and the rhetoric that gets paired with that militarization? I actually don't think it's highly problematic having space divisions or space commands within a military. I think perhaps having a separate armed force dedicated to space has some sense to it. It's the rhetoric that goes paired with it and the doctrines that get applied to it that are concerning to me. And this is something that I do take an unashamed stance on, which is that calling space a war-fighting domain is in itself an irresponsible behavior. It is inflammatory and it causes unnecessary rise of tensions in a domain which we are trying to maintain as stable, accessible to all. So there are ways that we can apply these responsible behaviors, norms, rules, and principles, not only to directly to arms control initiatives, but also to what are the doctrines and strategies and policies that states are putting in place. And so a watershed moment, I agree, would either be, for me, actually the one that's most likely is going to be a massive collision with these mega constellations that are being developed. So commercial actors developing constellations of hundreds, thousands, and in one case, tens of thousands of very small satellites. The space traffic issues that brings with that, and the greater risk of exponential space debris. But again, it is one of many issues, and I think each of these issues has to be dealt with in a quite specific way.
I do think it is a great question, and I think the answers might affect, the direction of the process of PAROS, or even, the global governance of space. So from an evolutionary perspective, law is always supposed to be, developed together with the development of space technologies and activities. So in this case, we have many challenges, of course, brought by the gaps between the existing legal system, like SLATA, and the new developments. And my colleagues also already, addressed some challenges brought by commercialization of space activities. It is true, but I would like to just focusing on PAROS issue, or arms control in space, or we say governance of space security. So on account of this, whether it is urgent to have something new, so just allow me, it is not an answer about yes or no. It's depending on what is the characteristics of the new things. So the first point I would like to address is that there are some misunderstandings about the rule of law. When talking about the rule of law, it's super important for global governance, and people always think about to make new laws, to have new things. But actually another very significant approach to the rule of law is the interpretation of lex lata. That's why I just addressed the significance to seek for common recognition of lex lata. So in this case, simply to say, when we're talking about whether we need a new, maybe dress, a new house, it's based on our, evaluation and judgment about the old things, whether we are satisfied with them. So the precondition should be, we must be very clear about what are they. So in this case, I think we already touched upon several points there about the interpretation of harmful interference, as mentioned by Aaron, and the meaning of peaceful purpose. And besides, I would like to address that the function of general international law is somehow underestimated, at least by space lawyers. So when talking about the law of state responsibility, the regime set up in that we say customary international law or general principle of law anyway, the circumstances to preclude the wrongfulness of a state, regarding the specific behavior. I think it just provides a very detailed guidance to a state just to predict the legality of the activity to be undertaken by it. So, but we are just lacking of such kind of serious legal discussion, no matter forgive me, no matter in Copilus or CD. So that's the second point. And the last point is about that we do have something, we need something new, but that's about we need to have a list of the common threats to us or to space systems. And we are supposed, as lawyers, we like a specific scenario. Just give me a specific case. We're not generally supposed to talking about certain behavior. One behavior might be deemed as legal in one case, but illegal in another one. So then, let alone talking about the responsible or irresponsible about the specific behavior. So we need some new methodology, some new framework to move on. So that's the last point.
Hi, thank you to the panelists. And I love the Gil Scott-Heron reference, so that was great. I'm Julia Baum, and I'm a PhD candidate at King's College London. And I'll direct my question to Aaron, as he mentioned the inevitability of space war, and also any panelists willing to answer. But as we're discussing behaviors and intentions, this isn't removed from the signaling use of language and rhetoric. The discourse on space warfare has been recently tangoing between it's avoidable and it's inevitable, much of which blurs perceptions of truth, skews the value of principle, and heightens perceptions. Can you offer some insight into the threats this language poses, and perhaps what you think about the signaling of inevitability in the context of space warfare, and also how this language can be redirected? Thank you.
Sure, no, I think that's a really great question. And just to highlight again, I do not see conflict in space as inevitable. I generally treat the word inevitable as something that should be used very delicately, although recently within the context of space conflict, it has been thrown around quite a bit. So I think, I'll go back and underline something that Cassandra said. I think that in these cases, it's really important to separate the establishment of military structures and organizations from the actual doctrines that are employed. So it's really in the doctrines, the strategies, and specific military objectives that I think we have to drill down in our analysis to evaluate whether or not something is potentially stabilizing or destabilizing. That being said, I do think that certain kinds of rhetoric, talking about supremacy, hegemony, superiority, first of all, those things are very difficult to measure. If a state says that it's going to establish superiority in space or supremacy in space, that's open to a lot of interpretation as to what that means. But it can be interpreted as not only inflammatory, but of course very aggressive, and you can certainly get into somewhat of an action-reaction phenomenon that can be destabilizing. So I think it's important for states to talk responsibly with regard to national security activity, because states will continue to engage in military activity in space to support a wide variety of national objectives, and that doesn't necessarily have to be inherently destabilizing. But for a productive, especially multilateral discussion, I think it would be generally useful to refrain from this terminology that doesn't necessarily really add anything that, like I said, can be quantified or measured, and certainly doesn't promote values that are consistent with stability. But that being said, I do think it's important to continue to separate the hyperbole from the realities of what we're seeing develop. One final point I would say is, using history as at least a frame of reference, in the 1980s, we saw a lot of similar language come out of specific national contexts about supremacy and superiority in space. And while it did create certain challenges to the diplomatic framework at the time, to diplomatic engagement that was taking place on national security space matters, it didn't result in some precipitous decline in stability. And there was an era of restraint that was more or less reinstituted in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. So I don't think that we should necessarily see some of the language that's come out in recent times, while disconcerting, I don't think we should see that as inevitably leading to some type of a really dangerous or destabilizing scenario. But fundamentally, I don't think that it's helpful to the dialogue. So I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
I'm going to pass to Cassandra now. You touched on this a little earlier in your remarks, so I'll pass to you to see if there's anything you want to add on that. Cassandra, the floor is yours.
Because I wanted also to highlight something that popped up in another question on the WebEx Q&A. Someone asked, what role does science or tech communication have in avoiding issues to do with proliferation, including damage to the outer space environment? So I think you're right. I think it was Julie, I'm sorry. Language matters a great deal. It's extremely important. And understanding what's so specific about the space environment is important, and understanding how dependent we all are on space. I would think in some ways the whole world is dependent on space in ways beyond how we're dependent on land, sea, or air, because we are dependent on different parts of the globe, different parts of land, different parts of the sea, depending on where we are geographically, whereas we're all dependent on space and services from space. And we're all impacting space with this increase in space traffic and the tensions around the strategic targeting in space. And so while we want to see greater access to space and equal access to space, we have to think very, very carefully about what that means. And so I would agree wholeheartedly with what Aaron just said about any language that's talking about hegemony or dominance or superiority or denying access to adversaries, any language, as I highlight again, that calls space a war-fighting domain, rather than calling it an operational domain, a strategic domain, these things that are factual descriptions, which do something very different. They highlight the importance of space for military operations, for strategic purposes, and for national and international security. And that's necessary so that militaries can get their budgets, so they could get people and expertise working on it. But what we need to do is educate a much wider range of decision makers and policy makers in national governments and also in international governance. And I think that's starting to happen much more at the international level. I think there's probably a lot of catch up to do in a lot of countries at the domestic or national level, particularly for those newer entrants. Countries like Australia, like New Zealand, a lot of middle powers and a lot of smaller countries that are excited to enter the space economy need to understand what the strategic implications are of using certain language, need to understand that there are regional implications, there are implications for our relationships with our friends and allies, as well as with our so-called adversaries or those with whom we have tense relations. That work, although I've said, and we've all said, that space is just another domain where geopolitics is playing out, at the same time, there are some things very specific and unique about space. Because of its physical properties, because of how dependent we are on it. And there needs to be a much greater understanding of the political and strategic implications of the language being used. So I would think that, in fact, science communication and diplomatic education has a great role to play. And in all of these polycentric, multi-layered different ways that space governance is taking place, there needs to be, I guess what it is about educating our decision makers and our policy makers to understand that every word matters.
So I just now been kept thinking about the three relevant questions: whether space is battlefield, whether it already becomes a battlefield, or whether it will become battlefield. So as to the first one, from a legal perspective, it is a wrong conclusion, of course. So as to space lawyers, we have been very cautious to define the characteristics of outer space, whether it is a global commons, common heritage of all humankind, or res communes. So from this point, I think it is just simply a wrong conclusion. And as to the second question, or whether it has become a battlefield already, I think it is difficult to answer. It depending on the different perspective once they would like to look at it. I heard the comments from our colleagues carefully, and I agree that sometimes such kind of announcement, we see several similar announcements already there. So some of them might be based on the concern, I would like to say maybe just internal needs sometimes. It's try to, just as far as I'm concerned, it's personal view, try to show the legitimacy or the necessity to establish independent space force, just to cater for the new tendency of outer space. It's already become a battlefield, so we need an independent space force. It's simple. However, unfortunately, at the same time, it just brings some very negative international influence, of course, as addressed by our colleagues as well. It's just, unfortunately, deteriorating the very vulnerable, relations in space. It would cause some misunderstandings or miscalculation, misperceptions, or misresponses. And as to the last one, whether outer space will become battlefield, of course, again, that would be the last picture we would like to see. That's what we are sitting here, it's just the value or the objectives of all kinds of international initiatives try to prevent the military conflicts in future, let alone space war in future. So again, it's depending on, I would like to say, the wisdoms and courage of our diplomats, our lawyers, to do so. That's just my, the thoughts came into my mind at present. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Guo Yu. And noting the time, I'm now going to switch to some online questions. And the first one that I have is as follows. In light of the apparent competition to exploit space as a warfighting domain, what are the options available for countries who do not have the capacity and capability to develop and acquire space defence programs? And I'm going to go first to you, Cassandra, for this one. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, I think it comes back a little to what we were just saying in response to how do we deal with whether it's inevitable or not, that it becomes a battlefield, which is that, and in some ways you could draw parallels, I guess, with nuclear proliferation. What can non-nuclear countries do either to defend themselves against the threat or to ally themselves with a nuclear power? It becomes a little bit of a security dilemma in some ways, which is, I think, why all of us have highlighted so much the necessity of thinking very carefully about rhetoric and doctrine and policy and the language used, because the security dilemma is created when one or two powers start to assert the threat is so great that they need to ramp up their space military programs, and in response, of course, their peer competitors ramp up their space programs, and we see an upward escalatory cycle. The worst thing possible would be for smaller countries to jump onto that bandwagon, in part because if it is a smaller country with a smaller economy, or if it's a new entrant to the space sector and space technologies, it's an impossible catch-up game to play, and there will always be an imbalance. But also because if our global concern is to keep space stable and peaceful to the extent that it is today, sustainable, usable for future generations, we need to be thinking with intergenerational equity in mind as well. Then really what those smaller nations need to be doing is working very closely together and with middle powers to pull back that escalatory cycle, to convince the greater powers that strategic restraint is in their interest, because that was the dominant shared understanding throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War. There were, of course, dips, there were moments of tension, but we always returned to a kind of strategic restraint. And we've seen a move away from that in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And that's concerning. And I'm convinced that in a multipolar reality, middle powers, particularly those that are very closely tethered to and allied with those greater powers, particularly countries like my own, like Australia, and all of our friends and all of the countries that we want to exert influence on, we have a huge role to play in bringing back that rhetoric a little bit. And I think we can be successful in it if we are working together, if we are thinking long term, if we are thinking sensibly, and if we are empowering people like our Departments of Foreign Affairs and Trade to do that kind of work, to make sure that space really is on the agenda. So I'm an optimist in that sense, but I feel like I have to be, otherwise I can't possibly be in my line of work.
Thank you, Cassandra. It always helps to be an optimist. To try and get through a few more questions, I'm going to go straight to another question from online now. And the question is, so far the arms control community has focused mainly on governing risks through regulations, rules, principles, etc. Shouldn't we also be thinking about governance of innovation and conducting responsible innovation in outer space? If yes, what would a responsible innovation framework look like in the outer space discussion? And to respond to this question, I'm going to go to you, Aaron, for your thoughts. The floor is yours.
So I think for starters, responsible innovation, I think anytime a word like responsible is used, again, there's a great degree of interpretive flexibility. But I think in terms of principles that should govern thinking on responsible innovation in space, one of the first things that has to be considered is what are going to be the broader impacts of any kind of activity, not only for other state actors, but also for commercial space actors as well. What are going to be the environmental consequences? And I think something that's come out of this panel that is cause for optimism is that in general, I think there's much greater awareness today, even among policymakers, that any kind of activities in space that could have detrimental impacts on the space environment affects all spacefaring nations and even countries that don't have formal space programs but are dependent on space. So I think that having responsible innovation that is really focused on preserving the space environment in particular, I think that that should be at the forefront of any organization's mind, any organization's agenda that's going to engage in space-related innovation. And one tangentially related point, I think that this greater focus on environmental consequences is cause for optimism, because something that does make the space environment unique as compared to other domains is that it is something that really touches all nations in a fairly unique way, and also touches the popular imagination in a fairly unique way, as Cassandra mentioned. And so I think that that growing recognition is going to guide the kinds of activities that governmental and non-governmental organizations take part in. I think it's going to guide the nature of their behaviors, and ultimately, I do think that there's cause for hope as we try to address some of the pressing issues that we've been discussing on the panel. Thanks.
Another sentiment in support of optimism. Thank you very much, Aaron. I'm going to go to another question now from online. And the question is, one issue that has arisen that is a change in the space domain is the rise of non-consensual RPO activities. Would love to hear the panelists' thoughts about how that affects space security and stability. And I assume RPO is rendezvous and proximity operations, but correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm going to this time throw to Guo Yu to answer this question. Guo Yu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruth. So I think it's again, first, I mean, in essence, it's do you technology designations. Then RPO could be used for military purposes. I think it's also the truth. We have to be cautious that such kind of behaviors, the RPO, we say like frequent or largely carried on and RPO against another state without any prior notification or the necessary coordination or consultation. It's just bring high risks, to cause maybe accidents, like for instance, like in orbit clearance. So such kind of behavior, I think that's the challenges to us, or could be deemed as some threats to us to be dealt with. And in this case, since I'm a space lawyer, I always like to look at it, from legal perspective. First, it's not prohibited by space law. There's no provisions, expressly prohibit such kind of behaviors. But there are many, again, relevant principles like due regard, prior consultation, or even the non-harmful interference principle set up in ITU convention. So such kind of principles or provisions, again, my point is always about its concern is about its applicability. Whether such kind of principles and how these principles apply need to be examined case by case. So again, as a lawyer, I would not like to answer what should be the due limitations to such an RPO. I need a specific scenario. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Guo Yu. And I think we have time for one last question from online. And the question is PAROS an appropriate framework for discussing space security? Can space systems be separated from arms racing in other domains? And I'm going to get each of our panelists to say a few words on this, keeping it relatively brief because we are coming up against time. But I am going to go first to you, Cassandra, for your thoughts and wrap up. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and I have found this to be a really rich discussion, so thank you. I think I just need to return to my previous comment that these issues need to be dealt with in multiple governance frameworks and systems. So PAROS in the CD is important, although clearly it has limitations in its ability to move forward in any concrete sense, but that doesn't mean it should be abandoned. I also see the PAROS agenda as being a General Assembly agenda. There is an open letter that has been distributed, and I'm not sure if it has been sent to Antonio Guterres yet, to the Secretary General of the General Assembly. But that's an open letter that came out of the Outer Space Institute at the University of British Columbia in Canada, that was drafted by a very small group of space security experts, and is now, there's an invitation internationally to get signatures to say we need to have a prohibition on debris creating ASATs, including the testing of debris creating ASATs. And that's going to the General Assembly. And so PAROS is an agenda for multiple UN bodies to focus on. But it doesn't stop there. I mean, we need to be, as you've heard, I'm a big fan of the General Assembly resolution on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles on responsible behaviours. And I agree with Guayu that we need to be clear about not just what we think is nice and responsible in a moral sense, but what does that mean legally? We also need to be dealing with it as part of the as part of the various agendas that I mentioned, where the G7 has it on the agenda, where various multilateral and unilateral security agreements have it on the agenda. So yes, I think it's an appropriate framework, but it's insufficient if we just leave it in that framework.
Thanks very much, Cassandra. Aaron, I'm going to pass to you for some final reflections on that question.
Sure. I just want to both echo and reemphasize that no, space cannot be dealt with in isolation from other areas of national security affairs and strategic issues. So if we're going to talk about potential arms control initiatives in the future, nuclear arms control, looking at advanced conventional capabilities, space has to be a part of that conversation because it's linked technologically. It's also linked from a military strategic standpoint. In terms of PAROS being sufficient or insufficient, I think that there's certainly limits, and I think my colleagues have both highlighted some of those limits, especially from a legal regulatory standpoint. But I do maintain that having any kind of multilateral engagement on the subject is beneficial. But as Cassandra just said, I think it's necessary to move it into an even higher echelon of multilateral engagement.
Thanks indeed, Aaron. And now, Guoyu, over to you for your final remarks.
So as to me, the most important similarity, always a common point, is that the ultimate goal of all kinds of arms control initiative is to achieve internationally strategic stability. It is actually, it was addressed by previous Ambassador Shazhu Kang, to Geneva just several days ago at the 20 years anniversary of CACDA. And I'm very convinced by this point. So he also mentioned that it's not arms control is not always mean like to ban or forbidden something. To achieve the due balance or strategic stability, sometimes the international community has to consider to open the door to develop something to achieve such kind of balance. So it has to be examined case by case. Again, it's about the methodology. And in this case, my last comment would be as to like responsible, irresponsible behaviors have been discussed, mentioned for many times. So, for the international community, when just come to evaluate a specific space behavior, it is not a matter about good or bad, professional or amateur, or even legal or illegal. It should be based on the concern whether such kind of space behavior might be contribute to preserve the internationally strategic stability, or on the contrary. So that would be my last comment here, and thank you so much.
Thank you indeed, Guo Yu, and I think that's a good note to wrap up on. We are at time. I think we've covered a lot of issues this morning. I hope that that has set the scene well for the remainder of the conference. A lot of the issues that were raised this morning will, of course, be addressed in greater detail in subsequent panels. But can I just take this opportunity to thank all of our panellists for their remarks and their insights today, and for joining us at not particularly convenient times of the day. So thank you indeed, all of you, Guo Yu, Cassandra and Aaron, and thanks also to the audience here in the room and online for your questions as well.